For more than 2,000 years, one of the most basic questions about one of Europe's most sophisticated ancient civilizations went unanswered. Not what they built, not what they believed, not even what happened to them. The question was simpler than all of that, and somehow far harder to solve. Where did they actually come from? The Etruscans left behind stunning tombs, a written language nobody else on the continent spoke, and a level of engineering and art that shaped the Roman world that eventually swallowed them whole. And yet, ask a historian for centuries where this culture originated, and you'd get two completely different answers depending on which ancient writer they trusted. One answer said Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, an entire people who supposedly sailed west and settled in Italy. The other said they never went anywhere at all, that they simply grew up out of the Italian soil itself. For 2,000 years, nobody could prove either version. Then scientists did something ancient. Historians never could. They opened the bones themselves and read the actual genetic code hiding inside. And what they found didn't just answer the question, it exposed exactly why humans got the story wrong for 2 millennia. Stick with me, because the real twist in this story isn't just where the Etruscans came from, it's what their DNA reveals about how language, identity, and ancestry can completely separate from each other in ways almost nobody expected. To understand why this mystery persisted for so long, you have to go back to the original source of the confusion. And it starts with a Greek historian who never even set foot in Etruria. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, told a specific and vivid story. According to him, a famine so severe struck the region of Lydia, in what is now western Anatolia, that half the population was forced to draw lots and sail away in search of a new home. He claimed those refugees eventually landed in Italy and became the Etruscans. It's a dramatic origin story, complete with desperation, exile, and a fresh start on foreign shores. Centuries later, another Greek writer named Hellanicus of Lesbos offered a version pointing toward the wider Aegean world. But Roman historians told a completely different story about the very same people living right next door to them. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BCE, insisted the Etruscans were not migrants from anywhere. He argued they were autochthonous, a term historians use for a population that simply arose locally, tracing their roots to the Bronze Age Villanovan culture that had lived in central Italy for centuries before anyone called them Etruscan at all. So for 2,000 years, you had 2 respected ancient sources, writing in 2 different traditions, giving 2 irreconcilable answers about the same people. And here's the detail that makes this genuinely fascinating. Rather than just an old academic dispute, there was actually a real clue embedded in the mystery that made the migration theory feel plausible for so long. The Etruscan language itself was strange. It doesn't belong to the Indo-European language family, the enormous branch of languages that includes Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and eventually nearly every language spoken across Europe and much of Asia. Etruscans sat there, surrounded on all sides by Indo-European speaking neighbors, as what linguists call a language isolate, with no clear parent language and no surviving descendants. If a language shows up somewhere with no relatives nearby, one obvious explanation is that the people speaking it came from somewhere else entirely. That linguistic oddity kept the migration theory alive for centuries, even as archaeologists digging through Etruscan settlements kept finding pottery, tools, and burial customs that looked distinctly local, evolving gradually out of existing Italian cultures rather than arriving suddenly from across the sea. For most of the 20th century, this argument played out entirely through archaeology and linguistics, 2 fields that, however rigorous, were essentially working with indirect evidence. Nobody could directly test where a specific Etruscan person's ancestors had actually lived. Early attempts to settle the question through genetics ran into their own frustrating dead end. Scientists sequencing mitochondrial DNA, a specific and more easily preserved type of genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line from modern Tuscan populations, found something intriguing, a genetic relationship to present-day Anatolian populations. That finding, published in various forms starting in the early 2000s, seemed to hand a partial victory to Herodotus after 2,500 years. But other researchers testing actual ancient Etruscan remains using that same mitochondrial approach found no clear genetic continuity between the ancient Etruscans and the people living in that same region today, except in a few isolated pockets of Tuscany. The genetic evidence was contradicting itself depending on whether you tested modern people or ancient remains, which meant the debate remained essentially unresolved heading into the 2020s. The reason for that contradiction turned out to be a limitation of the method itself, not the conclusion. Mitochondrial DNA only tells you about one narrow genetic lineage, traced through mothers, and it represents an almost negligible fraction of a person's total genome. To actually settle a question this complicated, researchers needed something far more comprehensive: full genomic sequencing capable of reconstructing a much fuller picture of someone's ancestry rather than a single narrow thread of it. And that required both better technology and, just as importantly, actual ancient DNA samples well preserved enough to sequence at that level of detail, something that had been in frustratingly short supply from the Etruscan heartland for years. That changed with a landmark study led by Cosimo Posc, a researcher at the University of Tübingen's Senckenberg Center for Human Evolution and Paleoenvironment, working alongside senior author Johannes Krause, director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Published in the journal Science Advances, the study did something no previous genetic investigation had managed. It assembled a genomic time transect spanning almost 2,000 years, extracting and analyzing ancient DNA from 82 individuals across 12 archaeological sites in central and southern Italy. Rather than taking a single snapshot of Etruscan genetics at one moment in time, the researchers built something closer to a continuous genetic film reel, tracking how the population's ancestry shifted or didn't across 3 distinct time intervals from roughly 800 BCE through the Iron Age and Roman Republic, continuing into the Imperial period, and extending all the way to around, if you're the kind of person who finds it fascinating that a 2,000-year-old historical argument could actually be settled with hard data, go ahead and hit that like button, because this is exactly the kind of story where the evidence itself becomes the plot twist. Here's what the genome actually showed, and it's worth sitting with because it overturns both simplified versions of the old debate at once. The individuals associated with Etruscan culture carried a high proportion of what researchers call steppe-related ancestry, genetic heritage traced back to pastoralist populations that migrated into Europe from the Eurasian steppes during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, roughly the same enormous demographic wave that reshaped the genetic map of nearly the entire European continent thousands of years earlier. Critically, that ancestry profile was essentially indistinguishable from the genetic makeup of the Latins, the neighboring population living in Rome at exactly the same time. In other words, despite speaking a completely different non-Indo-European language, and despite maintaining a visibly distinct culture, separate burial customs, distinct art, an entirely separate writing system, the Etruscans were, genetically speaking, essentially the same population as the Romans living right next door to them. There was no evidence whatsoever of a recent large-scale population movement arriving from Anatolia. The genetic story fit the Roman historian's account of local, gradual development almost perfectly, not the Greek account of migration and exile. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, in a way that even the researchers themselves flagged as one of the most intriguing parts of the entire discovery. If the Etruscans were genetically almost identical to the Latins around them, and if steppe ancestry associated with the arrival of Indo-European languages had already swept through the region by the Bronze Age, why on earth were the Etruscans still speaking a non-Indo-European language centuries later? Genetically, they had absorbed the same ancestral populations that brought Indo-European languages to essentially everyone else nearby. Linguistically, they had somehow held on to something completely different, older, unrelated to anything spoken around them. Johannes Krause and his colleagues describe this directly in their published findings, calling the persistence of a probable non-Indo-European language isolate, surrounded by Italic Indo-European speaking groups, an intriguing and still unexplained phenomenon. The DNA had answered the ancestry question decisively, but it had simultaneously deepened a completely separate mystery about language and cultural identity that genetics alone cannot solve. This distinction matters enormously, and it's honestly one of the most valuable lessons buried inside this entire story, because it's tempting to assume that genes, language, and culture all travel together as a single package whenever a civilization moves or changes. The Etruscans proved that assumption wrong in spectacular fashion. A population can undergo a near-total genetic transition, absorbing enormous waves of new ancestry, while still preserving a completely unrelated language and cultural identity for the better part of 1,000 years. That's not how these transitions usually unfold. In most documented historical cases, when a dominant genetic group moves into a region, they eventually impose their language on the people already living there. Or vice versa, language and biology tend to shift together over enough generations. The Etruscans appear to be a genuine outlier, a case of profound genetic assimilation happening alongside near-total linguistic resistance, and researchers still don't have a fully satisfying explanation for exactly how or why that happened. There's one linguistic clue that hints at how deep this isolation actually ran. Etruscan is not entirely alone in the historical record. It appears to belong to a small family linguists called Tersenian, which also includes Raetic, a language once spoken in the Alpine regions to the north, and Lemnian, a language attested on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean, of all places, thousands of miles away by sea. That Lemnian connection has fueled its own separate round of speculation over the decades, since it does gesture faintly back toward the eastern Mediterranean world that Herodotus originally pointed to. But even here, the genetic evidence urges caution rather than certainty. A shared distant linguistic ancestor, possibly reaching back thousands of years before the Etruscan civilization ever took shape, is a completely different claim from a direct Iron Age migration event bringing a Lydian population straight to Italy. Language families can persist and scatter across enormous distances over extraordinarily long timescales without requiring anything like the dramatic, sudden refugee narrative Herodotus described. The DNA evidence draws a hard boundary around what kind of migration story the genetic record will actually support. And a Bronze Age or Iron Age mass movement from Anatolia to Italy simply isn't in the data, no matter how tempting the linguistic echoes remain. It's also worth grounding all of this in what the archaeology on the ground had already been suggesting for decades. Because the genetic findings didn't emerge in a vacuum, they landed on top of a substantial body of existing physical evidence. The Villanovan culture, named after a 19th century excavation site near Bologna, occupied much of the same territory that would later become Etruria, and its material record shows a clear, gradual, uninterrupted evolution rather than any sudden break or foreign replacement. Cremation burial practices, distinctive biconical funerary urns, and metalworking traditions all show continuous local development stretching from roughly the 10th century BCE into the emergence of recognizably Etruscan culture by the 8th century BCE. Archaeologists studying settlement patterns, house construction, and ceramic styles across that transition have found the same populations occupying the same sites, building on the same traditions, simply growing wealthier, more urbanized, and more artistically sophisticated over time. Exactly the kind of pattern you would expect from indigenous development rather than displacement by outside newcomers. The genome data essentially confirmed in the language of population genetics what archaeologists had already been arguing from. None of that diminishes just how spectacular Etruscan material culture eventually became. Their tombs, cut directly into soft volcanic rock at necropolises like Cerveteri and Tarquinia, were built to mimic the interiors of actual houses, complete with painted walls depicting banquets, dancing, and hunting scenes rendered in colors that have survived remarkably for well over 2,000 years. Etruscan metalworkers produced gold jewelry of such delicate, granulated detail that modern goldsmiths have spent decades trying to fully engineer their exact technique. None of that artistic and technical achievement required a foreign population arriving from across the sea. It grew directly out of a local Iron Age culture that had centuries to develop its craft, trade extensively with Greek colonies in southern Italy, and absorb outside artistic influences without ever losing its own distinct genetic or cultural core. The story doesn't end with the Etruscans' origin, though, because the same genomic time transect that resolved the ancestry question also captured something else entirely. What happened to this population after Rome eventually absorbed Etruria by the 1st century BCE? During the imperial period, roughly from the 1st century CE through the 5th century CE, the genetic profile of central Italy underwent another dramatic transformation. This one far better documented historically than the murky Bronze Age transitions from centuries earlier. Researchers found that during this window, approximately half of the region's ancestry became linked to populations from the eastern Mediterranean, a genetic signature reflecting the sheer scale of population movement that came with Rome's imperial expansion, soldiers, slaves, merchants, and administrators moving across an empire that, at its height, connected North Africa, the Levant, Anatolia, and Western Europe into a single interconnected political and economic system. Post described this finding in striking terms, noting that the Roman Empire appears to have left a long-lasting contribution to the genetic profile of Southern Europeans, effectively bridging the genetic gap between European and Eastern Mediterranean populations on the broader map of Western Eurasian ancestry. In a strange twist of historical irony, the very Anatolian genetic connection that Herodotus had wrongly attributed to the Etruscans, distant Bronze Age origins turned out to arrive later, and for entirely different reasons, driven by Roman imperial dynamics rather than any Etruscan migration story at all. That detail alone helps explain why those earlier mitochondrial DNA studies on modern Tuscan populations kept finding a genetic connection to Anatolia. They weren't wrong that the connection existed. They were wrong about when it arrived and why. Modern Tuscans do carry meaningful Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, but genomic dating places its arrival squarely within the Romans. Imperial period, roughly 1,000 years after the Etruscan civilization had already fully developed its distinct culture and language, not from some Bronze Age exodus out of Lydia that Herodotus described. It's a perfect example of how a real genetic signal can point researchers toward entirely the wrong historical explanation if the underlying timeline isn't reconstructed carefully enough, and it took a full archaeogenomic time transect rather than a single snapshot of modern DNA to finally untangle the two separate migration events from each other. If you're finding this kind of detective work through ancient genomes as compelling as I do, this is exactly the kind of deep dive this channel keeps coming back to. So if you haven't already, now's a good moment to subscribe. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how much technical difficulty stood between scientists and this answer for as long as it did. Ancient DNA is notoriously fragile, degrading over millennia through exposure to heat, moisture, and microbial contamination, and the Italian peninsula's warm Mediterranean climate is genuinely one of the more difficult environments on Earth for genetic preservation compared to, say, the cold, dry conditions of Northern Europe or Siberia, where many landmark ancient DNA breakthroughs have originated. Extracting usable, high-quality genomic data from 82 individuals spanning 2,000 years across 12 separate archaeological sites required not just sequencing technology, but extraordinarily careful excavation, handling, and laboratory contamination control, since modern human DNA can easily corrupt an ancient sample if handled without extreme care. That difficulty is part of why the mystery took until the 2020s to resolve using this method, even though ancient DNA sequencing technology itself had existed in a more limited form for over a decade beforehand. This finding also fits into a much larger pattern that ancient DNA research has revealed across Europe over roughly the past 15 years, one that consistently complicates simple stories about which ancient people came from where. Time and again, genomic studies have shown that European populations are the product of layered waves of migration and mixture stretching back thousands of years early. Farmers arriving from Anatolia during the Neolithic, followed by pastoralist populations, sweeping in from the Eurasian steppe during the Bronze Age, followed by later, more localized movements tied to specific historical empires and events. The Etruscan case is a particularly vivid illustration of that layering, because it shows two entirely separate waves of Anatolian and Eastern Mediterranean, genetic influence reaching the same patch of Italian soil roughly 1,000 years apart for completely different historical reasons. And it took genome-wide ancient DNA analysis, rather than any single older method, to finally tell those two waves apart. There's also a broader lesson here about how easily a compelling story from a respected ancient source can calcify into accepted fact for 2,000 years, simply because nobody had a way to actually test it. Herodotus wasn't fabricating his account maliciously. He was likely recording a genuine origin story that Lydians or their neighbors told about themselves, a narrative tradition rather than a verified historical record. But once it was written down by one of antiquity's most widely read historians, it took on a kind of unearned permanence, cited and recited for 2 millennia, shaping how generations of scholars approached Etruscan archaeology, sometimes searching for confirming evidence rather than neutrally weighing the possibility that the story might simply be wrong. It's a reminder that even our most trusted ancient sources were still just people working with the information available to them, sometimes secondhand, sometimes shaped by the storytelling conventions of their own era, rather than rigorous historical verification. So where does this leave the Etruscans today, now that the genetic question has finally been resolved as thoroughly as modern science currently allows? They were not refugees from Anatolia. They were not, as some later theories briefly speculated, an entirely separate and mysterious population unrelated to their neighbors. They were, genetically, essentially indistinguishable from the Latins, who would go on to build Rome, descended from the same deep layers of Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age steppe pastoralists that shaped nearly the entire genetic landscape of ancient Italy. And yet they built a civilization so culturally and linguistically distinct that it took modern genome sequencing technology, applied across a 2,000-year time transect, to prove that shared ancestry and distinct identity are not contradictions at all. They can, and clearly did, coexist in the same population for the better part of a millennium, a detail that complicates the far too simple assumption many of us carry that a people's genes, language, and culture should always tell the exact same story about who they are and where they came from. The Etruscans, in the end, turned out to be neither the foreign transplants Herodotus imagined, nor people whose distinctiveness required any exotic explanation at all. They were genetically homegrown, and yet they built something linguistically and culturally unlike anything else in the ancient Mediterranean world. A language with no known relatives, a script that still holds secrets. Modern scholars haven't fully cracked, and an identity so distinct that ancient Greek and Roman writers argued about its origins for centuries without ever imagining the true answer would eventually come not from another historian's account, but from inside the bones themselves. If stories like this, where science finally answers a question historians argued over for 2,000 years, are the kind of deep dive you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more buried history waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.